As the world powers met at Berlin to draw up new borders for Africa, so began the colonization of this vast continent. Britain and France took the largest share of land, Britain claiming key ports in Egypt, Ghana, and Nigeria, as well as settlements in Zimbabwe and South Africa, while France controlled much of North Africa, which was dominated by Arabic-speaking countries. Belgium seized control of the Congo, while Spain, Italy, Portugal, and Germany had relatively small colonies. Ethiopia and Liberia were the only African countries that retained their autonomy. It is difficult to explain how people who had profited so much from the slave trade for centuries suddenly found themselves denouncing their own actions. The only possible explanation is that these imperial powers had changed their attitude, now wanting access to African resources rather than cheap labor. By demonizing slavery and presenting themselves as humanitarian saviors, they created a false moral justification to colonize swathes of the continent and exploit its inhabitants. The 19th century abolition of slavery in Africa promised freedom, but ended up ushering in a new form of subjugation. Colonial armies had driven out the slave traders, only to replace them with their own oppressive rule. Africa's promise of untold riches was quickly realized, as its resources were intensively exploited and its minerals and commodities shipped off to fuel the engines of Europe's burgeoning manufacturing economy. Britain reaped the greatest rewards. Its share of world exports grew significantly, with half of all cotton goods and 80% of all clothing exported from its colonies. France too sought profit, relying on the production and export of groundnut and cotton, yet their colonization of the Sahara proved both difficult and unrewarding. France's ambitions in Africa went beyond simply establishing their own rule. They sought to shape and transform the local population into French citizens. African towns were remodeled in the image of French cities like Dijon or Marseille, and becoming French became an avenue for greater prospects in life. However, even this so-called gift of citizenship was a facade. Africans remained subject to exploitation and discrimination, unable to take full advantage of their newly granted rights as colonial subjects. The French colonial dream of assimilating African people into their own culture proved a misguided effort. Military and governmental presence overwhelmed many of Africa's existing leaders, and the oppressive rule led to widespread grievances amongst its subject peoples. Only in Senegal, the capital of French West Africa, did a few individuals find some footing with which to exercise a political voice. Remote communities were able to escape much of the influence of French rule, but even still, the goal of creating a France in Africa failed miserably, in terms of winning over hearts and minds. Despite their opposition to the French policy of cultural colonization, British colonies still experienced its effects in practice. Aside from those which were explicitly set up by settlers, most British colonies saw a very small number of British officials installed. The preferred method of control was through the appointment of local leaders, thus ruling by proxy. This created huge discrepancies in terms of implementation, and resulted in tribal enmity, as African leaders viewed as working for the British were largely viewed with suspicion by their own people. At the Berlin Conference, King Leopold II of Belgium was awarded his own private colony, showcasing what colonialism could look like at its very worst. Though he had originally founded a committee with the aim of civilizing Africa, during his 23-year reign over the Congo Free State, he and his men amassed huge personal fortunes as the population decreased drastically. Men, women, and children were forced to collect huge quotas of rubber for export. Those deemed work-shy faced punishments ranging from hand amputation to even more severe forms of torture. John Dunlop's invention of the pneumatic tire in 1888 led to an increase in rubber prices, resulting in increased profits for Leopold and greater suffering inflicted by his men. Reports of these atrocities were compiled by Christian missionaries and British envoys and reached the world press by 1903, leading to Leopold's eventual exposure. It took a further 5 years, however, before the Belgian government finally repossessed the Congo from Leopold amidst a state cover-up. The imposition of European rule was a bittersweet encounter, with the rapid development meant to help African society often coming at the expense of personal freedoms. Roads were built, schools were established, and taxes imposed upon the people, all part of a system of high planning done not in a democratic manner, but rather by those in positions of power. This infrastructure served as an outlet for resources to be transported from mines and plantations to seaports, essentially serving to suck Africa's wealth out. This contrasts dramatically with India, where many roads and railways linked towns together for internal growth. In Africa, however, it was about exploiting its resources without any real drive towards bettering Africa's future prospects. Though the scramble for Africa may have delayed conflict in Europe, it could not stop it. When World War I broke out in 1914, Africans were called upon to make the ultimate sacrifice for their mother country, even if they had never set foot on its soil. Estimates suggest that at least 165,000 Africans lost their lives fighting for countries abroad. This increased further during the Second World War, when France and Britain's combined dependency on African troops peaked at around 500,000 men, proving that it was not only natural resources that were plundered from Africa, but also its human resources. After World War II, reforms to the colonial system were introduced by both France and Britain. In 1945 and 1946, Charles de Gaulle's French Constitution extended citizenship rights to all people, regardless of their educational level, while the British began appointing Africans to their colonial assemblies. However, it was too late to buy loyalty to the empire back. African nationalism had already been released. War had shown that Europeans were just like any other human being, brave, cowardly, and capable of everything anyone else could do. When these soldiers returned home to Africa, many became politicized and took part in the fight for independence, which ultimately led to liberation. With the end of the wars in 1945, the global powers promised, never again, in the form of the United Nations. The new UN Charter explicitly pledged self-sovereignty, with a committee dedicated to hearing the grievances of colonized people. This gave African nations a powerful platform to use for their fight for independence and deliver on the promise of liberation. The 1930s brought an economic depression to Europe, and the costs of running colonial administrations had skyrocketed since the start of the war. Meanwhile, Africa's war goods became increasingly devalued due to Europe's economic crisis. This, coupled with Britain's bankruptcy after World War II, meant they could no longer afford to run their colonies overseas, making money a powerful catalyst for change. Some British people in the Gold Coast were even sending rice and ground nuts back to their families in Britain, a clear indication of a reversal in fortunes, as Africa fed a very hungry Britain. Despite this, many in Europe still believed their empire could last as late as the 1950s. The colonial powers, however, were about to realize that allowing their subjects to observe global events had sown the seeds of their own rapid downfall. Moreover, grace was established as a foundation for the post-war world, producing an elite of African nationalist intellectuals, and behind them a large urbanized and literate working class. Together, they saw the strength of nationalism, in Egypt with Gamal Abdel Nasser removing the British, and Algeria, holding fast in its independence fight against France. Furthermore, the United Nations, the civil rights movement in America, and the anti-apartheid movement all shone a spotlight on black rights, helping to drive colonized Africans in their quest for self-determination. In 1957, Ghana became the first sub-Saharan state to attain independence, with power transferred to Kwame Nkrumah, who is often referred to as the father of African nationalism.